Museum stuff, the fun stuff, place you can take your kids, to the place you can definitely not take your kids, and that's with a whole bunch of educators for the Space Force at AU all over the country. This is going to be one of my favorite panels. I'm looking forward to this to see how this is going to go, what's in the future. Okay, okay. It's good to see everybody. Lieutenant Colonel Teddy Givler's here. How's it going up there at school? You good?
It's a great place to be.
Great. So Teddy's working on his PhD right now at Colorado. Dr. Greg Miller, space education for U.S. Air Force. That's great. Paul Springer's here. He's at ACSC with John Chirino, who's in the middle. And Larry Weaver, who is, if you're in this field at all, you know who Larry is. He's been around like forever doing everything.
That's the reason I have no hair.
So he's at the Navy War College now, trying to survive the dark blue of the Navy. So all is well. This is a great group of folks and have been doing this business for a long time. So let's welcome the panel and let them go.
Okay, so some rules of engagement. As you can understand, Dick is very excited about this. He reached out to me because we taught at the academy together back in the day and asked me to kind of help put this together in some respects. So that's what I did. I'm enthusiastic about this, maybe not as enthusiastic as Dick is, but I'm going to lay out some ground rules on how we're going to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this kind of as a round table. So each one of us is going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes or so on our experiences with education, space education in PME, which will span roughly the last 30 years to some degree, and different services, as you heard. I'm not going to introduce everybody with their bios. They're all in this lovely journal that we have here starting on page 11, and that way they'll free up more time for interaction, questions back and forth. So we're going to have Colonel Givler start, since he's got his teaching experience at the Air Force Academy, which is kind of the starting place for a lot of officer PME in some respects, and he can talk about what it's going in. And since he's actually in the Space Force, he has a different perspective than the rest of us in that sense. So, Teddy, take it away.
And let me know when you need these slides, okay?
Okay. They'll be next after Teddy.
Okay. So just a couple of anecdotes before I talk about the academy itself. This is the second time I've been here. The first time was 20 some odd years ago, and I was given a pretty above average tour by some guy named Dick when I was an RTC cadet a long time ago. And so the other is at the history department of the academy, we give out annual awards to like top, this type of history, this type of that. And so whenever a cadet wins this annual award, it's a big deal. And one of the gifts that the history department gives, which I find super cool, is that the advisor gets like a small budget to buy books for that cadet. And so just because there was a talk on it earlier, one of my guys won that award as his advisor, and he got I picked out a few great captains for him. And so he was not familiar with that book. He has since read it while he was in grad school, and obviously I think that's going to help him out later. So one of the opening comments that was made here was like the blending of people here, historians, people that have participated in these events, things like that. And I kind of see myself a little bit in two of those categories. Like I am a career space operator. I did get to participate in some of these events that we talked about earlier. Such as Task Force Tango. We mentioned Jack Fisher earlier, who had to go to another meeting. I worked for him on Task Force Tango. And so one of the interesting things that happened, and I was not in academia yet, I had not gone on to pursue a history degree at that point, was in the room with us in the basement of Building 1 Air Force Space Command headquarters in Colorado Springs, where we were locked, me and a lot of really smart people were locked in a basement for a month to kind of sort out what the Space Force should look like at the lowest level. So General Thompson talked about at the very highest level. I was at the very bottom in terms of what should it look like? What should we how should we design this structure of an organization? Ironically, one of the things, and I joked about this with Colonel Fisher earlier, one of the things we were not allowed to put on a slide anywhere at any time was the Air Force Academy. It was considered such a hot button issue that it would drive too many antibodies, I think would be Colonel Pettis' word for that, if we did that. So anyway, the interesting thing that happened there is a guy named Dr. Greg Ball. I didn't see him here. He is the Space Force historian, or one of them. He was the Air Force Space Command historian at that point, and he was in every single one of our meetings. And he wasn't just there to observe and take notes. He was an active participant in the whole thing. So we talk about where do we come up with a name for Delta or Guardian or anything like that. Like, he was part of that in a very distinct way. And one of the things that he helped with that was very interesting for us as the team trying to design this new service, because this is all pre-legislation, is he gave us things like the Key West Agreement. And we tried to, we got it, we dived into these documents of like when the Air Force separated from the Army, what did that look like? What were the pain points? What are some of the things we can try to not repeat in terms of those hard lessons? And so I think that helped a lot to have a trained historian in the room for all kinds of reasons, not just documentation, but he was an active participant. So that's a little bit of background. Onto the Academy itself. The Academy has come a long way, I think, in the last couple of years in terms of how it does space power education. Let's talk about that broadly. So for me, as a history guy in the history department, we have a History of Spacepower course. Poli-Sci has a policy class. I see Dr. Farquhar hanging out there in the back. MSS has their Military Strategic Studies, has their own space strategy type of curriculum. And one of the things that's kind of helped the Academy bring cadets into these classes is what's called the Space Warfighting Minor. And so that is coincidentally run by the Astro Department, but within this minor that cadets can take, if they're an Astro major of sorts, is they end up getting into my class, they go into or as the history part, they go into a policy class or a strategy class. And to put this in perspective, most of my students and I taught this a couple of times, were not history majors. Most of them were Astro majors and people that had a genuine like interest in space that were going to go on to be guardians of some sort in many cases. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so this minor has done a lot of good things in order to bring cadets that might not otherwise be in history, sir. It's a very STEM-heavy minor. It's a bit hard to onboard non-STEM people into it. It's astro-heavy. Like, they get into payloads and other, I'll just call it more astro-engineering-centric type things, but they also have places within that curriculum, if you were to look at it on a page, where they have to take total. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's not an inconsequential amount, though. It is... but it's for people it's really geared towards people that want to be guardians, I think, on some level. And so most of the students that I ever had in that course went into the Space Force after that. But as far as the amount of courses, I want to say like 12 hours-ish, maybe more, 15. Yeah. They're mostly Astro classes, but that was where they're able to get into the history of the Poli-Sci or the MSS classes. And Astro is a fairly large major, so you're talking about quite a few people here. And so that does a lot of good in terms of like exposing cadets to this type of curriculum that might not otherwise get it in their core classes or just don't take it because they're worried about building satellites or rockets or things like that. The other thing that I wanted to draw attention to for the Academy is a program that they developed over the summer, or a summer program, I should say, called Azimuth. And so that started when I got there about 4 years ago or so. And it was very small. It was the dream of a guy named Colonel Greenwood. And so what that was for was he had basically been briefed up on what's called Leatherneck. For anybody that's been to Annapolis, it's a Marine program for folks that come in that way. And so we wanted to create a summer program for space. And it started out very small, and then each year since then, it's gotten very big. So what it looks like at this moment in time is it's a combination. It's done 3 times every summer. It's got it's a combo of USAFA and ROTC cadets. It's now mandatory, as I understand it, for all ROTC cadets going into the Space Force. And so they get a lot of curriculum of various types. So, like, for instance, I gave a space history briefing in terms of how the service stood up. They'll get ones on like how authorities work for U.S. Space Command and various other higher level things that they might not otherwise learn until later in their careers. And so that's been very interesting for them. But also what they do is they also get kind of a crash course, for instance, in electronic warfare fundamentals, for instance. And so like the physics department and some others will come in and they will teach these cadets about like, hey, here's how EW works. But it's not just teaching them EW for the sake of teaching them EW, which I mean has utility in of itself. But one of the culminating events of the whole summer program is the Academy has partnered with the 10th Special Forces Group down at Fort Carson, and they end up doing some what I'll just call notionally joint training. Cadets will load up in a Chinook down at Carson, and they'll insert into Jacks Valley. For anybody that's familiar with the Academy, that's where basic training is done and things like that. And they'll end up doing some kind of interesting soft space training. It's very rudimentary in nature for kind of because compared to like real world operations, for instance, but it's very interesting for the cadets in terms of what they get to do and things like that. And so that program's roughly a month long. There's also a lot of base visits. They end up going to the NRO at ADFC or to Swiss or the various mods at Schriever and elsewhere. They get briefed by General Whiting, the combatant commander, personally, which he seems to take great pride in. He's very good with that. They go to industry partners like Sierra Space. For anybody that knows Mike Manor, like he gives a great tour of that, and ULA and some others. But with that, like these are fairly recent developments. The space warfighting minor is not that old. Azimuth is continuing to develop as a program. So there's just a lot of things the Academy is attempting to do to try to bolster kind of our space footprint, for lack of a better way to say that. And I've talked for long enough, I think, probably at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues on the panel.
I was going to say, I don't know what was in the history department when you were teaching there regarding space.
We were lucky to have the science and technology course.
And I taught that when I came after you in the early 90s. And I also taught a history of science and engineering class that had a little bit of space stuff in it, not really a lot in a certain sense. But the irony of that class was the first year I taught it, it had only astronautical engineering majors in it because that was a recommended elective for them to take. And it was an interesting experience working with them and doing that. But as far as where we were, it's a far cry from where you are now in that sense. So, Larry, you're up next. So Larry Weaver is.
So as a transition item, all of you that went to the Academy, everybody had that mandatory Astro course you had to take. Everybody remember that? Okay. It was my last engineering course of my first year, okay? And I remember doing the Snoopy dance and slamming dunking the book in the trash can saying, never, never again. So history your own history comes back to haunt you. So.
Excuse me, Larry. I'm sorry, but your slides are gone.
Okay, well, then we will do without. So we'll do hand signals, okay? In the stealth mode, there you go. Yeah.
Just describe.
Flexibility is the key to air power, right? There we go. I got to tell you, one of the luckiest things I ever ran into was the Naval War College Fleet Seminar program, where they basically take the entire Naval War College curriculum and move it out to various locations in the country, and they teach it with a professor. So, and it's a long story how I got involved in it, and my relationship to the War College is somewhat different than Phil's was, since he was the air power chair, I suppose, at a school that thinks Duhay is the most advanced air power theory they could possibly offer. So, the interesting thing about the program is that you've got graduate students who are active duty middle grade officers, civil servants, and yes, congressional staffers, okay? And I have two sections of these, one in the Pentagon, which as you can imagine is military officers and civil servants, and one in the GAO building, which is civil servants and congressional staffers. Now, why is that? Well, I would argue that Newport probably is the smartest and most foolish of the service schools, okay? Smartest in that they built a really first-class school. They built an incredible curriculum. They're smart enough to recruit congressional staffers who, once they have a master's degree from the United States Naval War College and later on the Navy comes and asks for something on a committee, what do you think the answer is? It's not a maybe or a no, it's almost universally a yes. On the other hand, what they do is they've built a really great school up in Newport for all the other services to come to. Because the naval officers that are usually sent there are the ones that are on shore duty that don't have anything else to do for that year. And it's an incredible mix of people. That's the reason why the distinguished graduates, whether it's a fleet seminar program or the War College Residence program, are almost always members of the other services and rarely the Navy. So what is it like to do this, and how do we do with space and so forth? The first thing that I try to do is say, you are going to be, if you graduate in this course, budding strategist. We have enough tacticians in the Pentagon. We have enough tacticians in most other parts of the government here. There's only a few of you that are going to begin to grasp that. And so we begin the process with a heavy, heavy dose of theory. And the interesting part is some of them will have come in, and when you say Clausewitz, they go, I know that German guy. And others say Clausewitz, they go, yeah, he's a guy that wears a red suit that comes down my chimney at Christmas time, right? And so there's a real variation in basic knowledge and so forth. And so in that space of that 1 year, meeting once a week for 3 hours, what I try to do is convert them into strategists and theorists and people that can maybe in this next generation keep us from doing something incredibly stupid. I motivate them by putting a slide up that shows 2 book covers that I modified. One I titled The Influence of Space Upon History and Some Principles of Space Strategy. For those of you who are familiar with Navy strategy and theory, those are stolen from Mahan and Corbett. And the idea in mind is that they will be the ones to write those tomes that will become the foundation of space theory, which we really don't have yet. Now, the point to this is for them to learn early on from the classical theorists what applies to the different historical case studies, but by the time we get to the end of the year, how to apply it to a modern environment where space has become important. I steal freely from the Air Corps Tactical School because in many ways the problems that those gentlemen face there are the same problems that the Space Force is facing now. In fact, it's actually harder because in the 1930s, there was some air power history. There had been a world war. There had, in fact, been opportunities to go ahead and develop some force structure and some ideas and so forth. For the Space Force, this is a different problem. At ACTS, we're trying to build a case for a separate Air Force. That's part of, when you read through the different lectures, and Phil, I think, made the remark that you can go and read through these things, and they're incredibly wonderful lectures to read through. And at the end of the day, underneath all of the discussion of theory is the simple fact that when World War II broke out, 2 powers did not have an independent Air Force, Japan and the United States, and they wanted to at least correct the United States problem. For Space Force, it is a different issue. You've already won the golden ring. You've basically got the opportunity to be independent. And now you got to ask the fundamental question, beyond the issues of technology and tactics, what does theory mean in space warfare? And that is part of what I spend my seminars developing, trying to get them to think about how do I draw together the experience of the tomes, the Clausewitz on War, Corbett, Sun Tzu, 5 Rings by John Warden, whatever the case may be, bring those together and begin thinking about how you're going to apply and create a new theory for space warfare. The good news and bad news part of all that is this is my least favorite time of the year. All of you who teach know what I'm talking about. Finals have come in. Administrators want the finals graded in September, so they have the grades ready by May. And at the same time, it's both exhilarating and depressing. It's exhilarating when you have 30 students and 28 of them, you look at it and go, oh my God, they got it. It's a wonderful experience. They've gotten what I need. And 2 are featured in my house as potted plants now. So with that, I'm going to pass it on, and I look forward to discussing how to go about developing space theory with students and specific with the folks at the Naval War College in Newport. Because like I said, they have not evolved past to hay. So no matter how hard you might have tried, Phil, it did not work, okay? No matter how hard I try, it still does not work. So you know, it is what it is. So, John?
Awesome. Good job, Larry. So when asked to put this together, I started thinking about my experiences teaching space and being involved with this stuff in PME. And I got to Maxwell, and largely thanks in big part to help from Dick Daso, in a sense. But I showed up in '99 to start teaching at the School of Advanced Air Power Studies. And Maxwell at that time had gotten its first commander, a Air University commander, who was not a pilot. It was General Lance Lord, who was, prominent in the space career field at the time. And shortly after that, a year later, ACSC got its first commandant, who was also not a pilot, and that was General Tom Sheridan, who was involved in space acquisition and that sort of stuff. So you can see right from the time I get there, there's this change in how space is kind of perceived in certain respects. Now, did it have an immediate impact? I would say probably not in a certain sense, but one of the things that started to happen at the School of Advanced Air Power Studies was the Space Command commander, who would in the future be General Lord, started sending personal letters to every single space officer at ACSC, encouraging them to apply to SAS. And we started to see an uptick in both numbers and quality of space officers at SAS. And then in 2001, we hired, as we used to say, and it probably is true, the first space theorist at Air University, which was Everett Dolman, and it was shortly after he had published his book, Astropolitique. And that kind of added more grist to the mill. We had Pete Hayes already on the faculty, and those of you who are familiar with space stuff know who he is. And many of my students at that time, over the next couple of years, are the leaders of the Space Force right now, some of them who have been mentioned just on this panel and in other panels too. So we started to see changes in this. In fact, it got so significant that in 2002, we changed the name of the school from the School of Advanced Air Power Studies to the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. And so we got extra S got to be kind of important, and not just because of what that does in terms of the acronym. So we were pretty robust in terms of what we were doing, the discussions that were going on amongst the people. Coyote Smith was one of the students who wrote 10 propositions regarding space power. Deliberately, a shout out to you, Phil, in terms of your book, and really worked on that while that was his SAS thesis. And we had all sorts of discussions, and some of them were related to, does space need a Duhay? And this was going on in the early 2000s as part of the general discussion at SAS. When I retired from the Air Force and got hired across the street at Air Command and Staff College as a civilian, I came in, and within a couple years, I was the course director for the Air Power course. And of course, doctrinally, the Air Force would talk about air, space, and cyber as separate things. And of course, we were required to use that term in everything we did in the air, space, and cyber course. So you can imagine the snarkiness of the students when saying there's no cyber in World War I, and this sort of stuff. But we were actively trying to put more space and cyber into the curriculum and trying to do that. We were sort of hamstrung in a couple ways because a lot of the stuff that was going on in space was classified and we couldn't really talk about it, and that was the excuses we would get for a lot of things. The literature was not maybe as rich as we would have liked to have had, and I would argue that the space chair over at the War College, every time we would invite them to come over and talk about something, we would get a boring lecture on wiring diagrams and reorganizations of the Space Command and other elements of space. So it really didn't help us advancing, talking about space and space power in a certain sense. But we were chipping away at that and working on that. We were helped a little bit when doctrine changed and air power included airspace and cyber, so now we can just throw that term around in a sense. But by the time we get to about 2015 or so, General Quast comes in as the AU commander, and he is a huge proponent of space, and he's really trying to make things happen. And our space faculty had started to grow to some degree. And one of the things that was going on at Air Command and Staff College was different parts of the Air Force were seeking to do PME outside of Air Command and Staff College. So like the air mobility guys had their School of Advanced Air Mobility that they were promoting. The nuclear guys with SANS, they had left the circle and were doing that. And so one of our challenges was try to get them back at least into the big tent to some degree. And what ended up happening in discussions with the space with the Space Command was we created, based on a vision I think that General Raymond had, was Schriever Space Scholars. And one of the elements of that, starting in 2017, was it wasn't just for space people, but it was to educate the rest of the force on this. So the seminars were supposed to have not just Space Command people, but all kinds of people from different career fields. And so we had started setting that up, and around that time, there was all these discussions about different elements. I was telling Teddy before we started this that there were, as mentioned before, when Mike Rogers had his screed about what was wrong with the Air Force custodianship of space, one of the things that was brought up that was specific to Air Command and Staff College was, oh, you only have 2 hours of space curriculum in your curriculum. Now, that was because one of his staffers was taking the distance learning program, and there were 2 hours in the program. I have here an artifact. I was going to show this to General Thompson to see if he remembered me delivering this to him personally at the Air War College, where we refuted that and showed that we had 60 hours of space curriculum in the course. But that all changed really quickly when we started standing up Schriever Scholars. And so we were then hiring more space-oriented faculty. I could argue that we might have had the best space faculty, space power faculty in the country, if not the world in some respects. By the time we got through this, we started with 1 seminar. By 6 years later, we ended up with 4 seminars of Schriever Scholars. And as was alluded to when General Goldfein, talking about this, and as Teddy was bringing up, the split, the divorce that, the Army and the Air Force had, which we still have scars from, I was in the room when General Goldfein asked everybody in the Schriever Scholars Program if they thought there should be an independent Space Force. And this is, well before this actually happened, in a sense, a couple years before that. And every hand went up. And Goldfein basically took that, and as part of what we know happened, he's like, we're not going to have a contentious divorce about this. And it kind of changed his mind when he saw that kind of opinion. And so the Schriever Scholars Program was doing very, very well. And then the Space Force was created, and there were different decisions about how they were going to do PME and the vision that General Raymond had for what he was going to do with that. And so it's been an interesting journey over the last 25 years or so to see how space education has changed in PME, and to be a part of some elements of that have advanced it, and maybe some elements that might not have advanced it as much as some people would have wanted. But I think it's become a much more integral part of our curriculum, and we're trying to do some really innovative stuff with it. The final installment we have now is after Schriever left and Space Force set up its own stuff, we now have the Grissom Space Seminar, which is an elective program. It meets, it's a year-long elective. We've done it for 2 years now, and it's sort of a throwback to General Raymond's vision. It's not of Space Force officers. It's mostly officers from other places, but it's a really intensive stuff in terms of space theory and space application and space power, and it seems to be really working in that sense. So that's my opening stuff. I'm going to pass the torch to Greg Miller so he can talk.
We'll see if you can turn on the mic.
Only if you want people to hear you.
Okay. I can talk loud, I think, loud enough to, for
Loud enough to not be recorded?
folks in the back to, yeah. So, yeah, my name is Greg Miller. I'm the Dean of Space Education for the U.S. Space Force. That's a much cooler title than it actually means. Basically, I am in charge of now the Schriever Space Scholars Program and the West Space Scholars Program as we've created these independent programs, these independent, essentially, schools. I was... a little bit of my background. I spent 10 years in civilian academia. I'm a little bit behind enemy lines here as a political scientist rather than a historian, but I can fake it, I think, sometimes.
I actually had a slide with the model on it. I was going to commit heresy, so there you go.
And that's why your slides disappeared.
And that's why it disappeared.
I've got them on my
That's
thumb drive here. Spent 10 years teaching in the civilian world, then started teaching at the Joint Advanced Warfighting School. Taught primarily strategy and terrorism. Those were kind of my 2 big areas. I had done a little bit of space in my master's degree, but not a lot. Got hired by ACSC, partly because of this guy.
Sorry.
And was initially hired just to teach in their core curriculum, but was really tired of studying terrorism. It was just, studying the worst part of everybody in the world. And so I started focusing more on space. Got involved in the Schriever Space Scholars, teaching a course for them initially. And then when the director became the dean, Andrea Harrington, she asked me to step in and become the director of Schriever. Then, as JT said, the Space Force wanted to create these independent schools. She moved on, and I stepped in as the dean as we basically moved out of Maxwell. So we are... For those who don't know, we are partnered with Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington, D.C. All of our classes are in the Bloomberg Center building in D.C. All of our students who come take, essentially, receive a master's degree from Johns Hopkins SAIS. So that's one of the biggest differences in our program for the Guardians than the other schools. They get a master's from a civilian university. We have Title X faculty as well as military instructors that teach our core courses, so they're getting a very traditional PME experience for the most part, but they also take electives from SITES faculty. And so they're, rather than take electives from other ACSE faculty, they take electives from folks like Tom Mencken, Lieutenant General Dave Barno, folks who've been, director of the World Bank, ambassadors, and our students can take any electives from SITES that they want. So they're getting experience not only from people that are outside the military, but they're in classes with civilian students, sometimes 22-year-old snotty, just graduated undergrad, but also a lot of people who have different experiences, federal employees in other areas. We have a very large international student body, including from China, and our students get a very different experience in those classes than they would in a traditional PME. The curriculum is one of the things we struggle with in our program, and I think all the services do to some extent, is how much to focus on the joint fight, like supporting joint warfighting, versus how much to focus on our service interests. And the challenge for us is we haven't really been given service interest. Space Force hasn't reached down and said, you will teach X, Y, and Z. Now, as an academic, I love that. I love the freedom of not being told what to teach. The downside is it's hard for us to point to things we're teaching and say, well, that's where it's coming from. Most of the time, it's just what we think our students need to know when they go out into the force. But we, like every other PME, we have a mix of students. We get probably about a third of our students are Guardian, but we get Army, Navy, Marine, we get international students, we get Department of the Air Force civilians as well as interagency civilians. We have our first NASA student coming in this coming year. And so they get a very traditional curriculum. They get all the Clausewitz and Thucydides and Sun Tzu. They get Introduction to International Relations, but they also get some space. And one of the things we struggle with is sort of that joint warfighting curriculum, that Space Force curriculum, and then how much to give them on just space, whether it's orbital mechanics or commercial space or other things. I think all the services kind of struggle with that, but like ACSE doesn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about commercial air power or commercial air, whereas that is such an integral part of space that we can't avoid it. So we have that tension tension's the wrong word. We have that sort of interesting balance between what the Joint Staff wants us to teach, what we think Space Force wants us to teach, and then just the really cool space stuff that we want all of our students to graduate and be able to say, yes, I can speak about space definitively when I'm on a Joint Staff or a J5, whatever it might be. I think I'm going to stop there. I can talk more, but I'm kind of interested to hear what questions you all have. So
We'll try this one more time and see whether it's, I don't know whether it's picking up or not. I'm PJ Springer. I have a PhD in military history where I studied prisoners of war. So you can imagine how applicable that is to space education. Thoroughly not. Also not real applicable to anything I do at Air Command and Staff College. I've been there for 16 years now. I got recruited into there, and it's allowed me to have some wonderful opportunities. And I'm going to offer some thoughts on what ACSC is doing and also what they're doing up at the Johns Hopkins campus, because I was given the opportunity to come in as an adjunct there and teach one of their strategy courses earlier this year. And in that role, I not only taught the course, I had the opportunity / expectation to do a little bit of a review of how things are going up there and offer some thoughts to them. Air Command and Staff College, for those of you that don't know, has primarily an operational level focus. We don't really get into the tactical level of war very often. We do dip into strategy, at least somewhat, as a mechanism to set our students up for the future of their careers. And over the 16 years that I've been there, the space curriculum has waxed and waned. It's never completely disappeared. It's never been a dominant element. It's kind of the redheaded stepchild of ACSC in some ways. And oftentimes the amount of attention it gets depends on how interested the U.S. Air Force is in space at that exact moment or that year of curriculum design. One of the things that I have to remind our students of on a regular basis is that while there have been many wars fought utilizing space assets, there are currently no active duty personnel that have ever fought a space war. There's also not one single active duty member of the United States military who has fought in a peer level competition. And so a lot of what we're doing is purely theoretical. And we're trying to give them the foundation so that in the horrific event of having a peer level fight, they might be better prepared to lead and command in that environment. And that's why we focus on the fundamentals as much as we do. Military theory, leadership, strategy, international relations, all of these are designed to give our students the tools to understand the context in which they're operating so that hopefully they can perform to their utmost best. Now, my good friend and colleague Greg Miller pointed out we don't really talk about commercial air power at ACSC, and that's because we don't want our students to go work for the airlines. And so we try to pretend there's no such thing as commercial aviation. If we can keep them ignorant for a while, we can keep them in uniform longer.
Pay them more.
Pay them more, yeah.
And the options of flying out of Montgomery reinforce that there really is no such thing
Yeah,
as viable
that's very
commercial
true.
air.
You can walk to DC almost as fast as you can fly here. So a lot of what we spend time doing is adapting military theory, classic theory, to air power and by extension to space power. And that's been an interesting challenge for us because at the end of the day, there are some fundamental truths that are supplied by military theory, but we don't always know how that's going to translate into practice. When it comes to the ACSC environment, I think there are some real positives to the way that we go about business. In particular, ACSC is undoubtedly a military environment. It's on a military base. We have access to SCIFs, to secure facilities, so we can teach curriculum at the top secret level if there are things that we think our properly cleared students need to know. We're a self-controlled and self-contained system, and that can be very handy. The outside influences stay mostly to the outside. Because the Air War College is one building over from us, they tend to get a lot of the attention. They also get a lot of the budget, but the upside is when somebody's staring at Maxwell, they're often not noticing that ACSC is even there, and that gives us a little more leeway than they have. We have a very large international officer population at ACSC. International officers comprise about 20% of our student body. They come from about 80 different countries. A lot of places that we fought wars against, which can be very interesting. I have taught unreconstructed Soviets in the past. We've had students come through that in their career had shot at American personnel. We had Afghan and Iraqi students with that specific experience. Go back far enough, and I had a Serbian that had that experience. And so that can be awkward at times, but also very illuminating for us. And we have, because Air Command and Staff College has been in existence for almost 100 years, we've got a very well-established curriculum. We've got a well-grounded faculty. We've got the support staff that we know from experience we need in order to carry out the functions of our school. And so in that regard, Air Command and Staff College has some significant advantages. That being said, when I went to the Johns Hopkins campus, there were some things that I was very jealous of.
IT worked.
It didn't. In fact, that was one of your downsides. It works great for people that are assigned there. It doesn't work at all for adjuncts. It took them. I was there for about 7 weeks, and the very last day that I was at the campus, I was informed that I could now pick up my ID badge to come into the building. So I made friends with the security personnel on the first day. I bribed them with donuts, and I was allowed into the building every day without any questions after that. There's a lesson there. I'm not sure what it is, but there's a lesson there. It's a very immersive academic environment there. It feels a lot less military, in part because their personnel are not wearing military uniforms. It's much easier for them to blend into the population there. I think that if they wore uniforms, it would probably provoke some prejudice and hostility that wouldn't be helpful for the academic mission. And so sometimes I'm kind of jealous. On the other hand, I do love having name tags. Really handy for somebody that struggles with remembering names to be able to cheat and pretend that I remembered exactly who you are. They're the only PME school that's not tied, or that's tied to a non-PME institution, and that makes them a really interesting experiment. It opens up all these wonderful electives for them, but it also makes them somewhat dependent on Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins is very well aware of the fact that they can leverage the Space Force. The Space Force is paying for the privilege to be there, but Johns Hopkins seems to change the terms of the deal on a somewhat regular basis, at least from an outsider. I remember the promises that were made before they got there, and I had to compare that to the reality when I actually got there and thought, okay, this is not what I expected. The facilities are beautiful, and the faculty members are, for the most part, in individual, very small cubicles. And so I never thought I would actually look forward to going back to my ACSA mold-infested office, which he previously inhabited. I'm not going to say you're the reason it was disgusting, but you were the last person in there.
It was disgusting because of Ed Dolman.
It was disgusting because of Ed Dolman. That's very true. Ev left some really horrifying things behind. Including, for some reason, Ev thought it was a good idea to order a fetal pig from a high school chemistry supply store. And then he just left it there in its vacuum-sealed packaging for a decade. I found it.
I didn't even know it was there.
I know. You did not open that cabinet. You made the right choice.
And I was there when he ordered it because they've got this catalog at SAS, and it said, hey, you can get a free fetal pig. And Ev being Ev,
Only
we're gonna
Dolman would
get
think
one.
that's necessary, but one of the things that I think they're doing very well right now that Dr. Miller didn't mention is they do a major capstone project, and this allows all of their students to investigate a subject of interest to the Space Force related to the space mission in a very deep fashion. Because they've got a high faculty to student ratio, they can really support those kinds of projects. Also, it's a very selective program, which means the caliber of their students is off the charts, and they are capable of some incredible projects. A lot of the capstones that I read really opened my eyes to completely new perspectives on very challenging subjects. And that small group cohesion also means the student body is pretty tightly knit, which can be a very handy thing as well. The synergy associated with them working together on these projects really create some wonderful things. Access to Johns Hopkins campus is a royal pain. The students don't live within a few miles of it, so they all have to get there, usually via public transportation, which if you spent a lot of time in DC, you know that can be a dicey prospect. And so for a lot of them, I mean, I had one student whose daily commute was 2 hours each way. It was a self-inflicted commute, but it was still a major challenge. To his credit, he made it every day. And he was one of the few students, I think he might have been the only one I had that made it every single day. The other students ran into problems on a regular basis. Because they don't live close together, they have less social interaction outside of the classroom. And so some of the opportunities for social cohesion aren't necessarily there. And then finally, the faculty numbers, even though their ratios are good, they don't have enough faculty right now to cover for the inevitable gaps that occur. When somebody has a major illness or some other catastrophe occurs, it's very hard to cover when you just don't have any slack in your faculty numbers. Because they're such a small operation, it sets them up for fundamental problems. And I'm hoping that they will get more faculty billets, but in the current environment, I'm not optimistic. If one or two of their people decide to take the retirement option, that could be disastrous for them, at least in the short term. Because it's a non-military environment, that attracts a certain type of student and turns away some. I think some of the students are probably coming there in part because it's in DC and they're already local, and so it's an opportunity for them to extend their presence in the nation's capital, maybe not because they necessarily want to go in residence, but because they want to be right there. But overall, I was very impressed, particularly in how fast they were able to establish this program. And look forward to some commentary on what they're doing and why they're doing it the way they are. So thanks for the opportunity. I'll turn it back to our chair.
So building off a couple things that PJ said reminded me of my own programs. So it's a tougher program to get into than any other PME because the students actually have to be accepted into SICE. So the services select them to go to PME. The students select to come to our programs, but then they have to apply to SICE. And we have had a couple officers that were told, we don't think you will make it. And then we get 3 stars, 4 stars calling us asking why. But it is an important, I think, gate to signal how valuable we in the Space Force treat this educational experience. The other thing I'll mention is we're one of the few programs that has the intermediate program, the majors, and the senior program, the lieutenant colonels and colonels, essentially co-located. They're different programs, they take different courses, but there's lots of opportunities for them to interact. And we actually set up a mentorship program so that the lieutenant colonels and colonels have 2 or 3 majors assigned to them for the year. And they're usually intended to be different services, so they actually get a little bit of joint interaction that way. Now, ACSC and Air War College, as you said, are literally across the parking lot from each other, and I think in my 5 years there, I had 1 interaction with Air War College. Like, they're separated by oceans through that parking lot. We intentionally took both Schriever and the West program that was at Air War College and brought them together under this one roof to have more of that synergy. And I think that's really valuable. I think the students get a lot out of that greater interaction. Sorry.
Yeah, one of the examples of the gulf that exists between the War College and ACSC is General Quast was very innovative in a lot of things he was trying to do. And one of the things that happened under his watch was we did joint electives between the War College and ACSC. So that involves syncing up the calendars on a single day that we could do this and offering up courses for both. The War College resisted this very strongly. And part of it, when we first started, was our commandant actually got it put through that we would wear civilian clothes for that, so there wouldn't be the rank distinction. So we were kind of emulating some of that. But after a few years, this kind of fell by the wayside. It was so bad, some of the animosity from the War College, that PJ was teaching in a classroom over there. He was locked out of the building. They would not grant him access on his CAC card. And it was not the higher-ups who were doing it. It was lower people there. And then I teach a course called the Air Force in Fact, Fiction, and Film, how to learn the history of the Air Force through movies and novels. And that course was looked upon disdainfully by the War College as not being rigorous enough and not enough. And ironically, the first student I had won their history paper, one of my first students in that class, because he was really good, and the course inspired him to do that. So yeah, in spite of our closeness, we are worlds apart in some respect. Before we get into more questions, I want to point out that it was mentioned earlier that there's not stuff out about the founding of the Space Force. Well, there is an article in here that was written by Pete Gerritsen, who was part of the Schriever Scholars, and there's pictures of the guys, Ev and Brent, who were part of that, and were instrumental in studying that. And then there's Francis Marion's book, Standing Up the Space Force, which I believe talks about the standing up of the Space Force. So if you're interested in that, these are perspectives on it. They might give you avenues for research if they miss something that you think is more important, which is, of course, something that can happen with that. So with that, I open the floor to questions.
Marion's work is conveniently available from the Naval Institute Press.
Yes.
Make sure you order a copy before you leave.
Which series is that a part of?
Part of Transforming War, a wonderful series with a lot of space opportunities for discussion.
So, JT, crazy small world we live in. So when Schriever Scholars stood up, I was the daddy rabbit at Air Force Space Command, Chief of Training. So, which was one assignment after I'd been up in Greenland with Teddy. So, yeah, crazy world.
Went to Maxwell.
What's that?
You and I went CDY to
Yep,
Maxwell.
we did. Very rarely did I get a blank check from a 4-star, but that was one day I did.
No, it was fascinating, the process of getting that going, got to see some interesting stuff. And then briefly, since I was the department chair and it was in the department, I actually was like running the program. But that was very brief because you needed somebody way more competent like Greg. Yep.
So one of the challenges we had at the time was when we were looking, okay, what would the core curriculum consist of and what books would they read? It was other than Ev Dolman's books, there really wasn't a lot of space power theory out there. And I'm just kind of curious, I know, well, there wasn't a lot. And so one of the thoughts we had was, if you get these great papers, how do you get them outside of the academic circle and get them out where they can actually influence the future of the service?
I mean, so I think a lot of that is It's interesting to see how the students have changed how they do research in the last 20 years or so. So by having all these papers now up on the websites, AU Press and these other places, they actually get used a lot more than you would expect in that sense. And then we've done a really good job, and especially it was mentioned, Paul's got his relationship with Naval Institute Press, and some others do too, where a lot of these papers get turned into books to some degree or another because of that, and that gives them some cachet there too. So that's part of it, I would say.
About 2015, we went on a hiring spree.
Yep.
And we hired a lot of very research-oriented faculty, very well-trained faculty. By having faculty that understood the publication process, we had a lot more resources for our students who could essentially show them how to get their ideas distributed to maximum effect. And so there was very much a snowball effect of wanting to get things published. Now, if you want to read a brilliant work on space power theory, let me recommend you pick up a copy of Sun Tzu in Space, published by our own Greg Miller. Which press is that from?
Naval Institute?
Weird, yeah. It's a fantastic work. Pick up a copy before you leave the room.
It's neither about Sun Tzu nor space, but that's okay.
Nor is it in the series I run. I just really like it.
No, and just sort of build off that, my first deputy in Schriever had been a student the year before. We got his thesis published as a Wright Flyer report through Air University. Up at Johns Hopkins, because of the weirdness of the calendar, we frequently will have a lot of students stay over past graduation in sort of like casualty status.
Casualty.
Casualty.
Casualty status would be bad.
You're dead to me.
They spent 10 months at
Missing
Johns
in action.
Hopkins. It is kind of casualty status, but casual status, and we'll help them to get their work publishable in a journal, whether it's astropolitics or space policy or something like that. So we actually really encourage all of our students to push their stuff out for publication. There also are archives, so we still use, I think, MISFRIC's, whatever the AU library for our past, but we're trying to work other options because we want to separate from the Air Force as much as possible.
You guys still use DTIC also, which is the Defense Technical Information Center. That is where a lot of the award-winning or award-nominated papers are archived, which makes them readily available to the public. That can also make publication more of a pain, because often publishers say, why would I publish this when it's already available?
Established by Hap Arnold, by the way. All right, any other questions?
So question over here. I'll make two comments, then a question. For my undergraduate and graduate level courses, I lean heavily on guest speakers, and that's really helpful for the commercial sector. So bringing in SpaceX people at the senior level, explaining what they're doing and why, whether it's astroscale for active debris removal and some of those technologies.
I think we bring you in to be a guest speaker.
That's occasionally.
I wonder if he's a fan of that program.
But just a pitch, and I'll let Greg elaborate. So the summer workshop on teaching space was a great opportunity for instructors to get together, share their syllabi. I'll share my reading materials, my primary and secondary sources, and the like. But Greg, you want to tell us? I know it's past the registration, but a little bit about SWATs.
Yeah, so we started this when we were still at Maxwell. 2021, I think, was the first year. It's basically a Teach the Teachers program. So we bring in people who are interested in learning about space, primarily to teach it, but also to do research on it. And we just have some of our internal faculty teach their areas of expertise. We bring in other experts like Patsy. I'm trying to get some other names. Diane Howard, who was at the National Space Council. Michelle Hanlon, who's down at Mississippi, folks like that to come and just talk about different parts of space. But it's also huge, great for networking and getting to know people. So yeah, SWATs, it's swats.space is the website. We're running it July 7th through 11th this year. We do already have a full list of participants. We're at 40 this year, but we'll probably be doing it again next year. So swats.space. Thanks for the shout out.
And one of the things that the money that we got to setting up Schriever Scholars allowed was those kinds of interactions started to happen a lot more, whether we brought them in or we sent the students. We used to have an annual trip for the Schriever Scholars up here to DC to meet with all these people and do that sort of stuff. So
We take them to the Space Symposium too.
yeah, and the Space Symposium, and so that gave us options that were not available necessarily to the regular student body at ACSC, and so it really helped put the program in a different kind of light.
I've been thinking about listening to all five of you talk about various aspects of curriculum and the newness of space as we're looking at it now. And we don't have any experience. We don't have any war in space yet. And so my curiosity is, as you go through developing curriculum, are the students going through from one or more of your different organizations, do you reach a point where a kind of a cumulative effort is something called space war games, and that you then take the academic side of this with the education across a number of areas or arenas here and what you have to deal with, and then set them into some sort of a creation, some sort of a competitive scenario?
You want to go first? You can go
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, in fact, that was one of the things I meant to mention. In the absence of any history of warfare in space, the only real way that you can kind of test the ideas is in wargaming, okay? And I put together the first Title X war game many thousands of years ago for the Air Force. And here's one of the things that it's both good and bad about it. Wargaming done effectively is like War Plan Orange at Newport. You train a whole generation of officers, not what the solution is, but what the problem is. And what happened to us with wargaming here between the time I started the Title X war game and the infamous war game known as the Millennium Challenge, anybody remember that? Okay. Was it became a political football. In other words, the war game became a tool to prove a budget rather than a tool to, in fact, train thinking about the problem. So I agree with you 100% that the way to develop space theory is through wargaming at this point until we get some other options, which we are going to get. I mean, it is going to happen. But the key to it is not to let the wargaming become a political football for proving a budget of which particular satellite to buy or which particular system is more important or what particular model of weapon system is important. I don't think we have a choice but do it that way. I really don't. And the key to wargaming, and this, I actually do some small wargaming games in my class, and I don't care what the outcome is. What I care about is, have you thought about the problem and the second and third orders of effects so that you can come back and say, I've worried with the issue, so if I ever encounter it, I've already thought about the problem in advance, which is not particularly insightful because that's exactly what the Navy did with War Plan Orange. But we have forgotten that lesson, and that's the reason why I think that wargaming that was so popular in the 90s and in the first decade of the 21st century has kind of faded in popularity. The Navy got rid of their Navy war game for almost a full decade. And then when they tried to bring it back, it was like trying to reinvent the wheel, and everybody was sitting around a rock wondering how to quarry it so it would be round, okay? And they've done a better job of it now, but it is nowhere near where it was when Bud Hay was running it, for example. That may make me familiar for those of you who do wargaming. But I think that the short answer to your question is that's the only tool you have to build serious theory on is, in fact, wargaming. I mean, shooting down a satellite in space and not building the fractional orbital bombardment system is about where operations in space, military operations in space ends. So you're actually in a worse position than the folks at ACTS were. The ACTS folks had history to write on to build theory. They just didn't have an independent Air Force. Space has an independent Space Force, but no history to write theory on. And it's a real conundrum. And there's a vacuum there that needs to be filled quickly. And I'll make this last point, and I'll shut up. You're talking about people writing some really insightful papers, and that's part of the building blocks. But what needs to be created is that Sun Tzu on war, or Sun Tzu, The Art of War, or Clausewitz, or Mahan, Influence of Sea Power on History, that seminal work that brings together space ideas into a coherent theory that can be taught and then be critiqued and be corrected and expanded upon. And right now, we're just not there. And I would argue, again, that you bring up a good point. Wargaming is probably the best tool we have until that time comes. Sorry, you hit a passionate point with me. So.
Well, no, I think it serves, as I think about it, in the gaming theory process that we've gone through for years and years and years, we see that you have to lay that out, but then it goes to the proverbial line. It goes to all hell in a handbasket. But that's where we learn what are the variables that are going to drive how this is going to happen. And of course, with this world, we have a whole new set of tools that are sitting up there or that we're going to use to go up there or use up there to come down here. So it is a new land, but it's once you have a theory going forward, you experiment with it.
Exactly.
And how can we expand that to get more practical and get this to work?
And there's no substitute for thinking. And see, we've got two other things that are working against us, okay? One of them is first of all, we're an ahistorical society. If you go out in the public out here and ask who was president before Biden, half the people would not remember. Oh, it's the same guy who's out there now. Oh, I didn't know that, okay? And that's advantages and disadvantages. It makes us very forward-looking. And the other piece is we're a technologically oriented society where we're looking for gadgets to solve our problems. And I'll make one anecdotal remark on it, and then I'll stop because there's other people who want to talk here. This weekend I took two cars to an antique car show, and I looked around at all the guys there. Every one of them was gray-haired, looked like us, okay? And so I made the joke. I said, well, in 20 years when we're all gone, the cars are still here. It won't matter because the millennial generation will be having an antique iPhone show, okay? And so it's simply a different problem. And so getting people to think deeply is a problem because of technology dependence and not having enough time to actually think, and rather than being ADD. I mean, we've made ADD be a virtue almost. Where multitasking means you can do many things poorly, okay? We're simply not wired to be that way. And having committed heresy now, I'll shut up.
So I would give 3 points on this. One is when I was at SAS, we did ASG wargaming with other ASG schools. Advanced Study Group is what the SAM, SAS, MOS, and that stuff. And that was very insightful in terms of the differences that the schools had. It's what they were expecting from their students. The Schriever Scholars have been participating in the Schriever War Game when it stood up when it was at Maxwell. We had them play roles in that, and they did stuff with that.
Getting coffee for people.
Yeah, well, that's
how
a
you
role. I don't know if that's still going on, but we were doing some of that. And then, as Larry kind of points out in a certain way, there's been a re-emphasis in wargaming, at least for Air Force PME. And so we have been working on wargaming the last couple of years, trying to figure out what the right solution is to get what we want to make the wargaming useful. Some of the vehicles we've been using have bogged us down in the rules of the game more than the actual thinking, but we're trying to overcome that and work on that and get better with that. So there's sort of a renaissance on it. I don't know if it's going to end up where it needs to, but we're working on that. I was going to ask you if you had any, did you guys do that at the academy in some ways?
So there's a couple different things that came to mind. One was, and again, I'm going to call it Dr. Farquhar in the back, right? The Military Strategic Studies Department has what's called a multi-domain lab, which coincidentally, he may have changed out, but was run by a Guardian, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart. It's a largely air-centric multi-domain lab, but it does have some space elements to it. And they're able to simulate some things in there, which I think are pretty interesting in terms of wargaming. But also in Azimuth, there was a space policy war game that the cadets got to take part in over the summer. And so those things do exist on a little bit more of a rudimentary level, I would say, than maybe ASG or some of the other PME organizations. But suffice to say, it does exist. And it's done in different forms to try to get at that problem.
Yeah, I mean, we do several different types of active learning exercises. We do an orbital debris exercise. We just finished up our capstone exercise, which is a crisis planning scenario, basically. The challenge, 2 points on this. One, for me, my own personal issue is the fact that war games always have to end in war. And so it's really hard to exercise deterrence. But that's such an integral part of what space is supposed to be doing right now. It's really hard to exercise that. The other thing, somebody mentioned the classification issue. To do a proper space war game, you either have to do it in a skiff and have people know what's going on in the real world, or you have to put it in 2050 and make it incredibly hypothetical, fictional. In which case, there's a lot of extra work that goes into creating, platforms that don't even exist yet. Our crisis planning scenario was 2030, so we could do a little bit of hypothetical, there's a space unit here doing X, Y, and Z, but it's really not satisfactory, and there's not a lot of good that I've seen. I mean, even Schriever War Game, there's not a lot of good ones that use space, and so it's most of the war games that are good are joint planning exercises that just teach them to be joint warfighters. The good ones have some space involved, but most of them just like sprinkle cyber and space on, somewhere. Okay, now cyber's turned off, react. I don't know how helpful those are.
Put in a nickel and got a buck back, right? Yeah,
Fortunately, it was a Canadian dollar.
there we go.
It's been a while. I was updating course material from Westfields out at, for instance, out at Nellis. And at the time, they were sending folks through to go forward to the KAOC. And the space was sprinkled in only CS, combat search and rescue for the operators. And then the operators turned around and said, okay, everything else space is now over in the ISR side, the Intel side. We don't really care about it. This is all at the academic school level. Are you working to get some of this now totally different space atmosphere, space stuff out to the operators at those schools or those courses that they go through before they're deployed, so that they're a lot smarter, or they maybe remember what they've picked up in the PME side of the house? There was a big shortfall. All the generals were saying, yes, we want space everywhere. And then when it comes down, it's, no, we don't have time in the course. The guys have to, the folks have to deploy. See you later. And that was a real big disconnect that I kept seeing from a standpoint of trying to upgrade systems.
Sure. Air Command and Staff College a few years ago built a new course entitled Contemporary Warfighting. And space is a huge component of that. Not only does that course allow us to look at things that affect us in the current and near future, it has a capstone planning exercise that space is very integral to. And the idea is, because we have members from all the services, but in particular a lot of active duty Air Force from all different career fields, in theory, this gives them a much better understanding of how space interacts with other elements of human conflict and forces them to confront the advantages and disadvantages they might face based on their decision making.
And I would argue General Whiting and General Saltzman have been useful at elevating some of what we teach. They've come in and they send people in to give classified lectures to our folks, and we have tried to have our curriculum integrate more with what's expected out in the operational world, and try to influence that to include more of that. The feedback is that we're getting better at this. It's a lot different than what you're describing in a lot of ways, so hopefully, maybe it's not because of us, but at least we're trying to be responsive to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little different direction. This is one of the many things that triggers me. I think a lot of our students who come in are not space experts.
Right.
A lot of them are just sent to us to do PME. Our goal, one of our goals, is to send them out to the force, to their service, to their agency, having more space expertise. The thing that bothers me is we will occasionally get students that go places where they can do a lot of really good things in space. We had a Navy officer who went to Space Command and was the exec for the commander there. We've had a student who went immediately to the J5 at the Pentagon, or the S5 at the Pentagon, and did strategy. But we've had students that just went off and the services sent them anywhere to do anything and it had nothing to do with space. And it's like, why did you waste 10 months of their Now, hopefully they're more strategic thinkers, they're more critical thinkers, right? They're better leaders having gone through the program, but they're not using space the way I would like them to as graduates. I don't want to get to the point where, when I taught at JAWS, all of our students, all the U.S. active duty, had to go to a joint planning billet. That was required by law. I don't want to go that far, but I wish there was a little more rationale in the placement system for our students. I don't know if that really gets to your question, but I think that's part of the puzzle.
It was mostly also just taking the normal operator who has to go through a quick course to deploy somewhere or to do a job and remind them that there's more to space than just one or two things in operation. It's now much more integrated and you really need to have an understanding with or without the PME.
So one thing I will pitch, NSSI, the National Security Space Institute, has a lot of free videos on YouTube about different parts of space. They also have a lot of lessons that folks can sign up for and take and get certification, Space 100, 200, 300. So there's a lot of things that people can do on their own time to get smarter about space. And we always try to push people in that direction if they're not coming to us.
I was just going to say that I think there's a greater appreciation for the importance and integration of space into operations, at least at the Air Force Academy at the undergraduate level, in the MSS department, not the history department, because they do something differently, and we're designed to be more contemporary operations as opposed to history, since I've taught in both, and with intent. That this is, and so it was mentioned that we have the multi-domain lab that every single cadet goes through as a third classman, a sophomore, of which a core course, that a third of that course is, and it's designed for the joint force and training how the services interact, et cetera, of which space and cyber, and we combine the two, does have very impactful role, and this is tying what we would call flight simulators, the immersive learning devices, ILDs, or flight simulators, all right, F-35 cockpits, et cetera, that are linked to an air operations center with space component as part of that, cadets doing both, cadets flying, cadets directing, and it's just something that's happened this last semester. The space aspect of it is much more robust. They hired programmers and they came up with things that, again, I'm not a space guy, so I don't know how accurate or what the programmers have come up with. But the idea is there is an appreciation that all the cadets understand the importance, and they do, for lack of a better term, wargaming, using all of these things. And the course that I taught this past semester, first time ever for me because somebody else had to depart, an air campaign planning course, over half the course, and this is an upper division majors course, was in the MDLs running 3 different scenarios. The final scenario was red versus blue, all cadets operating against their peers using and such things as the space component of the team has ISR capabilities, but the Red Force team, we're going to hack their space centers to prevent the dissemination of your opponent's ISR, that kind of level stuff. And this was all cadet planned. It wasn't part of curriculum, et cetera. So it's some really good quality, innovative things, of which I believe this summer there will be ROTC cadets integrated into a version of this. And I don't know any of the details on this, but I've just heard, hallway talk about the summer program that I think you had mentioned, that includes that. So I think there is definitely an appreciation. The great question is budget now, because the MDL is very expensive. And when we got, informed that we're losing 10% of the dean of faculty's budget, what's the one component that is vital, that's very sexy, that everybody likes, and we know that big Air Force and Space Force will support? Oh, it's the MDL. So what gets offered up to be cut? The very expensive but bright and shiny, everybody's proud of it, with the assumption somehow they're going to fund this. Well, we had several months where we didn't know it was going to shut down April 30th kind of thing. It got funded to extend a little bit, but I don't know the full details how permanent this will be because, again, as you know, a 10% budget cut is a big thing for, within the faculty.
Let me make a kind of a weird remark here about teaching and education. All of us have fought that eternal problem of the difference between training and education, okay? And it would be a wonderful thing if that line was really black and it was about this thick and you knew exactly when you stepped over the border. And the trouble is you don't. And as you get closer and closer to the training and further away from the education, and the emphasis, for example, becomes how do you become an efficient operator of a desk sitting in the KAOC or whatever the case may be. What happens in space, I would argue, is that you very rapidly get down to the things that space does that does to you here on Earth that are right here in your face, whether it's communications or facilitating cyber attacks or whatever the case may be. And so it's kind of like asking the Army what kind of airplanes you wanted to buy in between the wars, right? I wanted 70% pursuit aircraft. So that drives you to a certain type of thinking and force structure and so forth. And the other part of that that's on the theoretical side that we haven't done yet, and that is actually fight war in space, gets short shrift because it's not right there in your face, and it's way over on the education and theory side. And we Americans are very practical people. I mean, Thomas Jefferson's our great philosopher, and you had to read Rousseau, for example. There's a big difference, okay? And so as practical thinkers, that emphasis on the other half, on the thinking about the big strategic theory portion of this and where it's going to take you when you really fight war in space, we're just not there yet. And I think we assign it to the role of science fiction movies or whatever. And I think it's a big mistake. I really do, because right now I understand we live on the planet Earth with the exception of the half a dozen people that are living on the space station. But it's kind of like the argument with the Navy and the Army. We live on the land, therefore the Navy needs to support the Army. Nah, I'm not so sure about that, okay? And so it's a dichotomy that until we actually fight the war in space, it's going to always be there and be a problem. And the pressure is always going to be to go to the tactical training side. It's just hard. That's the reason why I know, John, I'm falling into old habits of calling Bubba, but John, the truth is that's one of the valuable things that you just described, of putting two opposing thinking groups of people into a room and make them think about the problem in a much more theoretical or futuristic way, and not just be wired to how do I support the KAOC mission or whatever. And the Air Force is right. They have to do that first. But we're kind of, in the education field, required to begin developing strategists and begin developing people that are thinking in this area. Sorry, I'm on my soapbox again.
I know we're the only thing standing between you and a cold beer or dinner, so.
And we sucked all the air out of the room, so.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
So, and last chances.
Standing in the way.
Yeah, last chances. Okay, and just a reminder, those of you who have worked in the Department of History at the Air Force Academy, we would like a group picture before we leave today. So put that in your reminder list before you leave. If
Great
we're done-
job, guys. That's good stuff.
Teddy, thank you very much, man. It was
So,
great having you here. Awesome job.
When we started this morning, you could probably tell I was a little trepidatious about how this was going to go. I'm in awe of the presentations today. I've learned a tremendous amount. I loved the diverse topics. It's always great to hear museum people talk about museum stuff. Educators talk about that part. Operators talk about that. See some old friends, old faces. tomorrow evening, I have some slots available. If you want to go to the banquet, come and see me after we're done here this evening. Does anybody not have their exit pass? Their bill, don't leave without one. We've got a pile of vouchers that get you out of the parking lot that I don't know exactly where they're sitting right now, but we'll find them. And that will get you out of the parking area. That's really about all I have. Jonna, do you have anything for the group?
Just a heartfelt thank you for attending, for joining us today, and those of you who are joining us tomorrow night. And to thank you, Dick, for firing me earlier today.
Yeah, if you aren't aware. Go ahead, Phil. Yeah, so tomorrow, you can come here, whenever you want during the day. I mean, I wouldn't come in the morning. If at 5:30 at the mezzanine overlooking the SR-71, we will be checking everybody in. Nobody can go down onto the floor until 6 because that's when the event begins, but also the museum is emptying out at that point. So if you're in the building before 5 o'clock, you'll be herded over towards the theater to kind of wait there. They may have the observation tower. I don't know if Meg's going to open it or not, but there's some lockers over there, a couple of restrooms over there, places to sit over there. But Angela will start checking everybody in. You'll get your table assignment at that time. At 6 o'clock, the gates will open, the bell goes off, and you can all go down around the SR-71. Chris Dunn will have everything set up down there for our reception. We have about an hour to mix and mingle. We've got a great sponsor who's donated us some wonderful wine for the evening. There'll be beer and soft drinks for you, for those of you who are coming. And then we'll also have that offering during dinner hour. And the dinner is underneath the tail of the space shuttle. So, I mean, it couldn't be in a more appropriate spot. It's going to be quite an event. So we have two parts tomorrow. We have, sort of the official part where we let everybody know who's there. And then we have awards, a lot of awards to give out, and they're beautiful, and it's going to be a wonderful evening. Any other questions on, you park out in the parking lot, come on in, watch the weather again. I mean, it was, I guess, was raining a little bit this morning. So, it's a little bit of a hike out there. So just keep an eye on the weather and do what you need to do. Don?
So this morning, early, there was a fellow with our names to let us into the parking freight. If we come a little early tomorrow, we have that.
I'm not exactly sure of the time that's going to happen, but
Remember, after 4 o'clock, it's free.
right after 4, they don't give you tickets anymore. So hopefully the weather will cooperate a little bit. Any other questions? Like I said, if you're not on the list for tomorrow night and find that you can go, come and find me. I'd like to truly thank AFA for helping us out and sponsoring this. What we're going to do with all this material is AFA is going to use some of this to turn into social media spots. We're going to use the panels, turn them into podcasts as part of what we put out on our podcast page. If you haven't seen it yet, Stu mentioned it, but one of the greatest things on there is our Origins of the Space Force podcast series. There's like 8 episodes. They're terrific, and there's going to be more. So that's terrific. We've released all of our book reviews and our book sessions from a year ago or a year and a half ago, and they're great too. And there's a lot of wonderful stuff on there. Just go to the AFHF website. There's a podcast button. Go there and start listening to podcasts. They're terrific. A lot of good things on there. All the journals are available on there too as well. And that's about all I have for admin for that kind of stuff. Be careful getting out of here. What time is it anyway? It's a little early. That's all right. I get a little time to walk around and see some things you may not have seen before you walk out for tonight. And if we're not going to see you tomorrow night, thank you for the sacrifice of coming here today. I know it was a long day. I get it. We had one day, and so it's either go big or stay home. I hope you got as much out of this as I did. And so please travel safely. DFHers over by the GB Racer, and gather up. Make sure you have all your stuff before you get out of the area, and please travel carefully. You still have time to mix with people if you want, but I think this has been super.
I heard great things about you. Okay.
What's that, John?
Gotta figure out where we wanna eat
You'll have
tonight.
more to deal with each other when you get back to the.
We've already got it
President
figured
of the Alumni Association.
Okay.
Yeah,
Did you tell
so
Sean?
You will be one